Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. A young couple, Sarah and Mark, decided to take a shortcut through a sprawling cornfield on their way home from a late-night gathering. It was a stretch of land they had passed by many times before, but tonight, something felt different. There was an unsettling stillness in the air, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. The field was vast, its tall stalks swaying gently in the cool breeze. It was like stepping into another world, a place removed from the normal, everyday chaos. They had walked down this path hundreds of times before, but as they entered, a strange chill seemed to hang in the air. Neither Sarah nor Mark spoke much, both distracted by the unease settling in their chests. Every creak of the corn seemed louder than usual. Every rustle felt like something was lurking just out of sight. They tried to laugh it off, but it wasn't long before Sarah noticed the strange footprints in the dirt. At first, she thought they were just from animals, but the pattern was wrong. These were much too large and appeared to be from something or someone with a gait that didn't match any human or animal they knew. Mark noticed them too, his hand tightening around hers as he pointed them out. "Do you think someone's out here?" he whispered, voice tight with tension. "Probably just someone who works the field," Sarah replied, though her words felt hollow. She wasn't convinced. The field was abandoned, or at least it had been the last time they walked it. They hadn't seen a soul for miles. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper, the once familiar field now feeling like a maze, with the towering stalks closing in on them. The quiet seemed to intensify, as if the world had gone mute, holding its breath. Suddenly, a distant rustle came from the far side of the field. It was faint, but unmistakable. Something was moving, something large. "Mark, did you hear that?" Sarah asked, voice trembling slightly. He nodded, and they both stopped, scanning the darkness. "Probably just a deer," Mark said, though there was no confidence in his tone. But then, the rustling came closer, much closer. They stood frozen, waiting for the sound to reveal itself. It was moving through the corn, not walking, but something more unnatural, dragging itself through the field. The noise was almost rhythmic, like someone or something was pacing, deliberately keeping its distance. But it wasn't far. The corn stalks began to bend, as if something massive was passing through, moving in their direction. The air was thick now, suffocating, and Sarah's heart began to race. "Mark, we need to get out of here." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like it echoed through the night. But Mark didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something beyond the corn, something he couldn't pull his gaze away from. It was just a glimpse at first, but it was enough. A figure stood between the stalks, its outline barely visible, but its shape unmistakable. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin, its limbs twisted at odd angles. The face? Sarah could hardly make it out, but there was something haunting about it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them. Mark didn't seem to be breathing. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. Sarah grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Mark, run!" They turned and bolted, adrenaline flooding their veins. Their feet pounded against the earth as they sprinted through the field, not daring to look back. The sound of something following them, something large, moving quickly, echoed in the distance. They could hear the corn breaking apart, the stalks snapping under something heavy and fast. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees. Mark was a few steps ahead, but when he turned, his eyes widened in terror. She saw him open his mouth to scream, but before any sound could escape, the thing was upon them. It didn't make a sound as it dragged Mark into the dark of the cornfield. She tried to run to him, but her legs betrayed her, and her body felt heavy, like the air itself was holding her back. As she turned back toward the path, she saw the figure again, standing at the edge of the field. Its gaze locked with hers, and in that moment, she knew it wasn't human. Her screams were drowned out by the sound of wind howling through the corn. She could hear Mark's voice, faint and desperate, coming from somewhere behind her, but it was too late. The cornfield had swallowed him whole. Sarah ran until she couldn't breathe, her legs cramping, but no matter how fast she ran, she never seemed to reach the edge of the field. And then the sound of movement stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was suffocating. She finally collapsed at the edge of the field, her body trembling uncontrollably. When the authorities arrived, they found no trace of Mark, no footprints, no signs of a struggle, just the wind blowing gently through the empty cornfield as though nothing had ever happened. But Sarah knew what she had seen, and as she was escorted away, she swore she could still hear it, the soft rustling of the corn, the dragging of something large behind her, waiting to claim the next victim.
Story number 2.
The small, rural town of Ashford was known for its peaceful atmosphere and charming country roads. People would often travel through, stopping to admire the sweeping cornfields and old farmhouses that dotted the landscape. But no one ever stayed too long, especially when the sun began to set. One fall evening, a young man named Danny, looking for a shortcut home from a long day of work, found himself driving along the narrow, winding roads just outside of Ashford. He had heard rumors about the place, the abandoned farm, the eerie things people had claimed to see at night, but Danny wasn't one for superstitions. He scoffed at the stories, considering them just the work of bored locals. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Danny's car headlights barely cut through the thickening fog that had begun to roll in. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 7:30 p.m., and decided to take a turn down an old gravel road he had never noticed before. It looked like it would save him a few miles, and he figured he could be home before dark. The road led him deeper into the countryside, and the further he drove, the more isolated the landscape became. The trees closed in, and the road seemed to narrow with every passing minute. He could barely see anything except the occasional outline of a dilapidated fence or a rundown farmhouse. As he reached the crest of a hill, something caught his eye, a large weathered sign half hidden by overgrown vines. Old Apple Grove Farm, it read. Danny remembered the stories his grandmother had told him when he was young, how the farm had been abandoned after a tragedy struck the family that lived there. A husband, wife, and 2 children had mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The house was left standing, a hollow shell of what it once was. No one had ever returned to the farm, and the town gradually forgot about it. He slowed the car, curiosity getting the better of him. The house was up ahead, nestled in the trees, the roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were broken, the door ajar as though waiting for someone to step inside. Despite a strange sense of dread creeping up his spine, Danny parked the car at the side of the road. He got out, the chilly autumn air nipping at his skin, and made his way up to the front porch. The old wooden steps creaked under his weight, and he hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The house smelled of mildew and decay. It was darker than he had expected, but the faint light from the moon cast an eerie glow through the broken windows. The silence was deafening, except for the occasional rustle of leaves outside. As he stepped into the main room, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Danny's flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The place was filled with old furniture, covered in dust, and there were strange symbols scrawled on the walls in what looked like red chalk. He wondered if they were from the children who used to live there, or perhaps some of the more superstitious locals who had come to visit over the years. He walked through the rooms, feeling the temperature drop with each step until he reached the basement door. It was slightly open, as though inviting him to explore. A cold gust of air seeped from the darkened stairwell, and Danny shivered. But his curiosity pushed him forward. He descended the stairs slowly, his footsteps echoing through the silence. The basement was pitch black, and as he reached for his flashlight, something made him pause. There in the corner was a large, old-fashioned rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth as if someone had just gotten up. A sudden chill ran down his spine, and the air grew thick, heavy. His heart began to race, and he couldn't explain why, but every instinct he had told him to leave. As he turned to retreat, a voice, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, sounded from the shadows. "Don't go." He froze, every muscle tense, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was clear now, coming from right behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The chair continued to rock, back and forth, the sound of its wooden legs scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. Without thinking, Danny bolted up the stairs, running toward the front door. His mind raced, But no matter how fast he moved, the house felt like it was closing in on him. The door was stuck. He tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Desperation flooded through him as he turned back to the dark interior of the house. The whispering came again, louder now, more frantic. "Don't leave. You belong here." Danny finally managed to push the door open, stumbling into the front yard. He didn't stop to look back, running full force toward his car, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he reached the vehicle, he slammed the door shut and locked it, gasping for breath. With shaky hands, he turned the ignition, desperate to get away from the house. As he sped down the gravel road, a strange sensation lingered, as if something was still watching him. But when he dared to glance into the rearview mirror, he saw nothing but the empty road behind him. The next day, Danny went back to the town, trying to tell himself it was just his imagination. He asked around about the old Apple Grove farm, hoping to shake off the lingering fear. But when he spoke to the town's older residents, their faces grew pale. "You don't go near that place," an elderly man warned him, his voice low. The house wasn't abandoned. It was sealed off by the family who lived there after what happened. No one's been inside in years, and they say those who go in don't come back. Danny tried to laugh it off, but the unease gnawed at him, and when he got home that evening, he glanced at the old photographs his grandmother had left him. One photo taken decades ago showed the family who had once lived in that house, but something was off. In the corner of the picture, standing just behind the smiling parents, was a figure, a pale, hollow-eyed man, his face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural smile. Danny froze, his blood running cold, and then, as the clock struck midnight, he heard it. A soft whisper just behind him in the dark. "You belong here now."
Story number 3.
The small town of Briar Hollow had a reputation, a place where everything seemed ordinary by day, but by night, the air carried a weight of history, of things best left forgotten. Everyone who lived there knew the stories, but it was never something anyone dared to speak of openly. It was a quiet, isolated community, nestled deep in the woods, and the people were careful to never venture too far from home after dark. One rainy evening, a young woman named Eliza, recently moved to Briar Hollow for a fresh start, decided to take a walk along the outskirts of town. She had heard the whispers about the old mill at the edge of the forest, a structure that had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. But Eliza wasn't one to be intimidated by rumors or ghost stories. The town seemed strange to her, and she wanted to get a better feel for the area, so she decided to see it for herself. The path to the mill was narrow, overgrown with weeds, and the trees around her formed an almost unnatural canopy, blocking out the sky above. The rain had softened to a light drizzle, and the air was thick with moisture, the scent of damp earth heavy in her lungs. As she walked deeper into the woods, the eerie quiet of the forest seemed to press in on her, making her feel as though she were being watched. The mill came into view after a few minutes. It was just as she had heard, a crumbling structure with shattered windows, its once towering wooden walls now covered in vines and moss. The mill wheel, though no longer turning, still hung from the side, a reminder of a time long past. Eliza hesitated at the entrance, looking inside. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and the air was colder than it had been outside. Her heart raced with a mix of curiosity and dread. What would it be like inside? Could the stories be true? She stepped into the mill, the old floorboards creaking under her feet, and the temperature dropped even further. The interior was dim, the only light coming from the occasional crack in the rotting walls. Dust hung thick in the air, and Eliza's breath became visible with each exhale. She slowly made her way through the mill, her steps echoing in the silence. As she wandered deeper into the structure, she noticed something strange. The walls were covered in old carvings, deep gouges that seemed to form patterns, symbols she didn't recognize. They looked almost deliberate. Something caught her eye in the far corner of the room, just by the old stone fireplace, a small wooden box half buried under debris. Her heart quickened, and against all better judgment, Eliza moved toward it. She knelt down and carefully opened the box. Inside was a collection of objects, a tarnished silver ring, a handful of brittle, yellowed papers, and an old photograph. Eliza's fingers trembled as she picked up the photo. It was a picture of a family smiling and standing together outside the mill. There was a man, a woman, and 2 young children, but what caught her attention most was the shadow looming over them. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, but as she stared at it, she could see the outline of a figure, tall, thin, with long limbs. Its face was obscured by darkness, but the feeling it evoked was unmistakable, a presence, watching them, even as they smiled for the camera. Suddenly, she felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. Her heart slammed into her chest, and she spun around, but there was nothing there. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Still, the unease in her chest wouldn't subside. The mill seemed to be alive now, the silence broken by strange sounds. Soft footsteps behind her, the faintest creak of the floorboards, as if someone or something was moving just out of sight. Eliza tried to shake the feeling, but the air felt thicker now, suffocating. She began to back away, but before she could reach the exit, the temperature dropped drastically, and the sound of faint whispering filled the room. The whispers grew louder, frantic, incomprehensible. She turned again, and this time she saw it. The figure from the photograph stood in the doorway across from her, tall and impossibly thin. Its limbs twisted at odd angles, and its face was obscured by the same shadow, but Eliza could see its eyes, dark and hollow, black as the void. The whispering came from it, but the voice wasn't human. It was ancient, deep, full of sorrow and rage. Leave. Leave this place, or you will stay forever. Eliza froze, her feet rooted to the ground. The figure's eyes seemed to burn into hers, and she could feel the air pressing down on her, as though the very walls of the mill were closing in. She took a step back, and then another, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, its presence suffocating. Suddenly, the temperature shot back up, and the whispering stopped. Eliza didn't need any more warning. She bolted for the door, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged in the cold air. As she reached the threshold, she glanced over her shoulder. Nothing was there. The mill stood still, as quiet as it had been when she first entered. She didn't stop running until she was back in the safety of her apartment. She locked the door behind her and sat in silence. The image of that figure burned into her mind. The next morning, she went to the local library, desperate for answers. An old woman behind the desk looked at her strangely as she asked about the mill, as if the question itself was forbidden. But the woman eventually spoke, her voice soft, almost reluctant. The mill was where the family lived, she said, her gaze distant. The parents, Charles and Sarah, were the last to disappear. No one knows what happened to them, but there are rumors. They say the figure in the photograph wasn't human, that it was something else, something that never left, something that fed on the souls of those who came too close. Eliza felt her stomach drop as the woman's words settled in. And now, the woman added, her voice barely above a whisper, it's looking for a new family. Eliza never went back to the mill. The town of Briar Hollow remained as quiet and haunting as ever. But for Eliza, the whispers never stopped. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that figure. And sometimes late at night, she could hear the whispering just outside her window. You belong here now. She couldn't escape. Not really. The mill had already claimed her.
Story number 4.
In the small town of Harrow Creek, there was a local legend that everyone knew, but no one talked about. It was a story that had been passed down for generations, whispered in dark corners and shared in hushed voices. No one dared to go near the old church at the edge of town after dusk. The church had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, its stone walls crumbling and its bell tower leaning at an odd angle, as though it had been cursed by time itself. The story was always the same. Years ago, the church had been a place of worship, a sanctuary for the townsfolk. But one night, the bell rang at midnight, and the town was never the same after that. The congregation was gone. Not one person in Harrow Creek could remember what happened that night. The church was abandoned, left to rot under the weight of its own mystery. And the bell that had never stopped ringing, had somehow fallen silent. But there was one thing the townspeople didn't speak of. There was something else in the church, something that had never left. Mia, a newcomer to Harrow Creek, had heard the stories, but she didn't believe in ghosts, legends, or curses. She was determined to make her own opinion about the town, its history, and its strange inhabitants. So one night, driven by curiosity, Mia decided to visit the church. She figured she'd take a quick look around, maybe snap a few photos, and leave. The church loomed in the distance as she walked down the overgrown path. It was more imposing up close, the towering spires and crumbling stone walls making it seem more like a fortress than a place of worship. The air felt heavy, thick with something that she couldn't quite place. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and pushed forward. When she stepped inside, the cold hit her like a wall. The church was dark, the faintest sliver of moonlight creeping in through broken windows. The air smelled like old wood, dust, and something else, something metallic, like blood. The floor was littered with shattered glass and broken pews, remnants of a forgotten time. She took a few steps deeper into the church, her footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness. As she explored, Mia felt a strange unease creeping over her. The oppressive silence pressed against her ears, and she could have sworn she heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, floating through the air. She reached the altar, where a large, decaying painting hung crookedly on the wall. The painting depicted a man in robes, his face twisted in an expression of agony, his hands reaching out as if to grab her. Mia recoiled slightly. The longer she stared at the image, the more she felt the air grow colder, as though something was pulling her in. Then she heard it, the faintest sound, something scraping against the stone like nails on a chalkboard. It echoed in the empty church, loud and sharp. Mia froze. The whispers returned, this time louder, clearer, and closer. She turned, but no one was there. The sound of footsteps was unmistakable, echoing from the back of the church. Slowly, hesitantly, she moved toward the sound, her heart hammering in her chest. When she reached the back of the church, she saw it. A door, slightly ajar, leading to a staircase that descended into the earth. The air from below was thick with the scent of rot, and the temperature dropped even further. Without thinking, Mia pushed the door open and descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. At the bottom, she found herself in a small, candle-lit room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the stone as if by desperate hands. The candles flickered, their flames casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. In the center of the room was a wooden pedestal, and atop it rested a book. It was old, bound in cracked leather, and the pages were yellowed with age. Mia approached it cautiously, her breath shallow. As she reached out to touch the book, a voice echoed from the darkness behind her, so close she could feel the cold breath on her neck. "Don't open it." She spun around, but there was no one there. Her pulse quickened. She tried to back away, but something compelled her to open the book. She slowly lifted the cover. The first page was filled with a single sentence, written in what looked like blood. "Once the bell rings, you cannot leave." Before she could process the words, a loud, jarring sound pierced the silence. The bell. It was ringing. Mia's heart nearly stopped. The bell had been silent for years, decades even, but now it was ringing. The sound was deafening, as though it was coming from inside her own head. Suddenly, the room around her began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the floor groaning under the weight of something unseen. The whispers returned, louder, more frantic. Mia turned, looking for the exit, but the doorway had vanished. The only way out was up, back through the stairwell, but something blocked her way. Someone was at the top of the stairs. She could see it now, a figure standing in the darkness, just out of reach of the light. Its shape was distorted, its limbs twisted at impossible angles, and its face was obscured by shadows. But it was smiling. It was smiling at her. The figure spoke in a voice that sounded both ancient and timeless. "You shouldn't have come." Mia tried to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The air became thick and suffocating, like she was drowning in the very atmosphere of the church. The bell kept ringing, louder now, shaking the very foundation of the building. And then the figure stepped forward. Mia never made it out of the church. The townspeople say they hear the bell every now and then, but no one dares to go near it. And some nights when the wind is just right, they say you can hear the whispers from inside the church, a faint, desperate voice, begging for release. Once the bell rings, you cannot leave.
Story number 5.
In a quiet, sleepy town nestled in the hills, there stood an old, seemingly abandoned mansion. It had been empty for years, its windows dark and covered in grime, and the thick ivy climbing up its crumbling walls looked like a living thing trying to reclaim the land. The locals rarely spoke about the mansion, but every child knew the warnings. It was said that anyone who went inside would never return the same. Some even whispered that no one who entered the mansion ever truly left. The tale of the mansion had become a part of town folklore, an unspoken truth that made people glance nervously at it as they passed by. But one rainy afternoon, a young man named Thomas, new to town and skeptical of rumors, decided to investigate for himself. He had heard the stories from the old shopkeeper, who warned him with a trembling voice that the mansion was cursed. The building had once belonged to a family of prominent figures in the town, but after the entire family mysteriously disappeared, the mansion had been abandoned. Over time, it had become more than just a symbol of decay. It became a place feared by all. Curious and dismissing the rumors as nothing more than superstition, Thomas made his way to the mansion. As he crossed the overgrown garden, he felt the air grow heavier, and almost as if the atmosphere was thick with a presence. The gate was rusted shut, but with a firm push, it creaked open, and he stepped inside. The front door was ajar, as though someone had left it open just for him. Despite a chill creeping up his spine, Thomas walked inside. The interior was just as he expected: dusty, cobwebbed, with furniture covered in sheets and a musty, stale scent that permeated the air. But there was something unsettling about the place, something that made his skin crawl. The house felt alive in a way he couldn't explain. It was as though the walls were watching him, whispering to each other in the quiet. The further he explored, the more he noticed strange things. A picture frame, still hanging crookedly on the wall, despite the decay of the house. A chair, overturned as though someone had stood up quickly and left in a hurry. The more time he spent in the mansion, the more these little oddities seemed to accumulate, until he began to feel that he wasn't truly alone. After wandering through the vast hallways, Thomas stumbled upon a door that led to a narrow staircase. His heart raced with a mixture of excitement and unease. The staircase spiraled downward into a basement, one that felt strangely cold even in the summer heat. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a large, dimly lit room. At first, it seemed empty, save for piles of old, rotting furniture and forgotten possessions. But then, in the far corner of the room, he noticed something odd. A wooden chest sat there, ancient and covered in dust. It was strange to see something so unbroken in a place so decayed, so Thomas moved toward it, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He knelt down and tried to open the chest, but it was locked. Intrigued, he searched the room for a key. Finally, beneath the decaying rug, he found it, a rusted key that fit perfectly into the lock. With a slow, deliberate motion, Thomas unlocked the chest. Inside was a small, intricately carved box. It seemed too delicate for the rotting room that surrounded it. His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid. There inside the box was a tarnished silver locket. It seemed unremarkable at first, but when Thomas opened it, he found a small, faded photograph, a family portrait. A woman, a man, and 2 children stood together, smiling as if nothing was wrong. But as Thomas stared at the photo, something in his stomach dropped. The faces of the family had been scratched out, as though someone had gone to great lengths to erase their identities. The locket felt heavy in his hand, as though it had been waiting for him. And then, without warning, the room seemed to shift. The air grew thick with an unbearable heaviness, and the whispers that had been distant grew louder, closer, almost as if they were speaking directly to him. "You shouldn't have opened it," they whispered, their voices low and hissing, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. Thomas stood frozen, the locket still in his hand as the room began to distort. The walls seemed to close in, and the once silent house seemed to awaken, groaning with life. He turned to leave, but the door that led out of the basement was gone. In its place was a wall of cold stone. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. "You belong to us now. You will never leave." Panic surged through Thomas as he ran through the basement, his heart pounding in his chest. But no matter how many steps he took, he couldn't escape the feeling that something was behind him, watching, waiting. The house was alive, and it had trapped him. Hours passed, or maybe days, Thomas couldn't tell. He stumbled through the house, trying every door, shook every window. but they were all sealed shut. The whispers followed him, always just behind him, telling him things he didn't want to hear. They told him about the family, about their dark pact with something far older than the mansion itself. And then one night, just as Thomas was beginning to lose all hope, he found himself back in the room with the chest. The locket was gone, vanished as if it had never been there in the first place. But the whispers had stopped. The silence was unbearable, suffocating. And then he heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind him. He turned. A shadow stood in the doorway, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to swallow the light. The figure smiled, and as it stepped into the room, Thomas could see its face for the first time. It was his own face. The figure reached out a hand, and Thomas couldn't move, couldn't scream. The last thing he remembered was the cold touch of the figure's fingers against his skin. And then everything went dark. The next morning, the mansion was silent again. The whispers had stopped, and the house seemed to settle into its usual decaying state. But something had changed. The house had a new occupant, someone who would never leave, not even when the town's stories faded into nothing. And when the children of the town passed by the mansion, they would sometimes glance at the window, just for a second, and see a face staring back at them. A face they couldn't quite place, but one that seemed to watch, waiting for someone else to come inside.